Thomas Wilson boarded Flight 627 to London on a busy Monday morning. The tall, dignified black man with short grey hair carefully adjusted the hearing aid in his right ear. He was nervous, but tried not to show it. At 54 years old, Thomas was used to the challenges that came with his partial hearing loss. Thomas had worked as a surgeon for over 25 years. He had helped people in more than 30 countries around the world. His hands had saved countless lives, but he still felt uncomfortable in noisy, crowded places like airports and airplanes where hearing was difficult. He settled into his window, seat in row 14, and placed his worn leather bag under the seat in front of him. Inside that bag were his notes for an important speech. Tomorrow he would show other doctors a new way to do surgery that could help people in poor areas. Thomas had worked on this method for 10 years, and now he was finally ready to share. The plane was almost full. A young mother with a baby sat across the aisle. An older man in a business suit took the middle seat next to Thomas with a polite nod. Thomas smiled back and turned to look out the window at the grey morning sky. "Ladies and gentlemen, please prepare for takeoff. All electronic devices must be switched off or put in airplane mode," came the announcement over the speakers. Thomas checked his phone and turned it off. He then touched his hearing aid gently, making sure it was working properly. Without it, the world became a much quieter, more confusing place. "Excuse me, sir," a sharp voice cut through his thoughts. Thomas looked up to see a flight attendant standing in the aisle. Her name tag read Patricia. She had blonde hair pulled back tightly and wore the navy blue uniform of the airline. Her smile seemed forced and didn't reach her eyes. "Electronic devices must be turned off during takeoff," Patricia said, pointing at Thomas's ear. "This is actually a hearing aid," Thomas explained in a calm, polite voice. "I'm hard of hearing." The people sitting nearby glanced over. The man next to Thomas looked uncomfortable and shifted in his seat. Patricia's face changed. Her fake smile disappeared. Her mouth became a hard, straight line. "I don't care what you call it. Rules are rules. Hand it over now," she said in a cold voice. Thomas blinked in surprise. In all his years of flying, no one had ever asked him to remove his hearing aid. He tried again to explain. "Without it, I won't be able to hear announcements or—" "I said hand it over," Patricia cut him off. Her voice was louder now. Other passengers were starting to stare. Thomas noticed something in her eyes when she looked at him. It was a look he had seen before: judgment, assumptions, prejudice. He had faced this kind of treatment many times in his life, though he hadn't expected it here today. "People like you always think rules don't apply," Patricia added in a quieter voice, but still loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The man next to Thomas looked down at his hands. The young mother across the aisle frowned. No one spoke. Thomas took a deep breath. He could argue. He could ask for another flight attendant. He could explain that hearing aids were allowed on planes. But years of experience had taught him that sometimes fighting back only made things worse. With calm dignity, he reached up and removed the small device from his ear. The moment the hearing aid came out, the world around Thomas changed. The engine noise became muffled. The baby crying across the aisle sounded far away. The captain's voice coming through the speakers became just a low, unclear mumble. Thomas handed the hearing aid to Patricia. She took it with 2 fingers as if it were dirty and walked away without another word. A knot formed in Thomas's stomach. He felt suddenly vulnerable, cut off from everything around him. What if there was an emergency? What if someone asked him a question? The feeling took him back to his childhood, before he got his first hearing aid, when other children would laugh because he couldn't hear them calling his name. Thomas watched Patricia walk to the front of the plane. She put his hearing aid in a small plastic bag and placed it in a drawer. The plane began to move. Thomas felt it roll away from the gate. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to stay calm. The important medical conference where he was scheduled to demonstrate his life-saving surgical technique now seemed very far away. All the excitement he had felt about sharing his work with the world was replaced by a familiar feeling of isolation. But Thomas Wilson had overcome many obstacles in his life. This was just one more challenge. He would get through this flight with the same dignity and strength that had carried him through much worse situations. Little did he know that this difficult moment would lead to something unexpected, something that would change not just his day, but many lives in the process. The plane climbed higher into the sky. Thomas Wilson sat quietly by the window. The world around him had changed. It was like watching an old silent film. He could see people's mouths moving, but he couldn't hear their words. The captain made an announcement, but Thomas only knew, because everyone looked up at the same time. This feeling of being cut off from others brought back memories, hard memories. As a child, before he got his first hearing aid, Thomas had often felt alone in a room full of people. Now, at 54 years old, those feelings came rushing back. Thomas closed his eyes. He tried to focus on his breathing. The medical conference was tomorrow. He needed to be ready to show other doctors his new surgical method, a method that could help people in poor countries where fancy hospitals didn't exist. But right now all he could think about was getting through the next few hours without his hearing aid. A light tap on his arm made Thomas open his eyes. The woman sitting next to him was holding out a small notepad. Thomas hadn't noticed her before. She was about 30 with short brown hair and kind eyes. She had written something on the notepad. "That was horrible. Are you okay?" Her name was Emma Taylor, though Thomas didn't know that yet. She had seen everything that happened with the flight attendant. She had watched how calmly Thomas had handled being treated so badly. Thomas took the pen she offered. He wrote back, "I've faced worse, I'll manage." Then he added, "Thank you for asking." He gave her a small smile. Emma wrote again, "Where are you headed to in London?" For the next 20 minutes, they passed the notepad back and forth. Thomas told Emma about the medical conference. He explained how he had created a new way to do surgery that didn't need all the expensive tools that most hospitals in rich countries used. His method could save thousands of lives in places where good medical care was hard to find. Emma's eyes grew wide as she read about his work. She wrote, "Why did you become a doctor?" Thomas looked at the question for a long time. He rarely talked about his personal life, but something about Emma's kindness made him want to answer honestly. He wrote, "Growing up black with a hearing problem, I faced double discrimination. I wanted to help others overcome their own barriers." Emma read his words and looked at him with new respect in her eyes. 2 rows ahead, a man named William Jones was reading a medical magazine. William worked as an editor for Medical Innovations Monthly. He was heading to London for the same conference Thomas was going to attend. William thought the man sitting 2 rows behind him looked familiar. He flipped through his magazine and stopped suddenly. There, on the cover, was the same face. Doctor. Thomas Wilson smiled back from the glossy page. The headline read, "Dr. Thomas Wilson's revolutionary procedure brings surgery to underserved communities." William read the first few lines of the article again. Dr. Wilson had created a way to do complex surgery using basic tools that could be found almost anywhere in the world. His method had already saved hundreds of lives in Africa and South America. The medical world was calling him a genius and a hero. William turned in his seat and looked back. Yes, it was definitely the same man who had just had his hearing aid taken away. William felt angry. He pressed the call button above his seat. A young flight attendant with dark hair came over. "How can I help you, sir?" she asked. Her name tag said Mary. She had a kind smile, unlike Patricia. William showed her the magazine cover. "Do you see this man?" he asked, pointing to Thomas's picture. "Yes," Mary said, not understanding why this was important. "He's sitting 2 rows behind me," William said, "and your colleague just took away his hearing aid." Mary looked confused. "What do you mean?" William explained what had happened during takeoff, how Patricia had demanded Thomas give up his hearing aid, how she had treated him with clear prejudice. As William spoke, Mary's face changed. First surprise, then shock, then horror. "That's Dr. Wilson?" she asked, looking back at Thomas. "The Thomas Wilson?" "Yes," William said seriously. "And your colleague just confiscated his hearing aid." Mary put her hand over her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. Thomas couldn't hear any of this conversation. He was still writing notes with Emma. He was telling her about the children he had helped in small villages, places where doctors rarely visited. Mary quickly walked to the front of the plane. She needed to tell the captain what had happened. This wasn't just any passenger who had been mistreated. This was Dr. Thomas Wilson, a man who had saved countless lives. As Mary hurried away, Other passengers who had heard William's conversation began to whisper to each other. They looked back at Thomas with new eyes. The story began to spread throughout the plane. The man in row 14, the one who had his hearing aid taken away, was actually a famous doctor, a hero. Thomas still didn't know any of this was happening. In his silent world, he continued his written conversation with Emma, unaware that he was becoming the center of attention on Flight 627 to London. Mary hurried to the front of the plane. Her heart was beating fast. She had to tell the captain what had happened. This was not just a small mistake, this was serious. "Captain Edwards," she said as she knocked on the cockpit door. "I need to speak with you urgently. Captain Robert." Edwards was a tall man with grey hair and 30 years of flying experience. He listened carefully as Mary explained the situation. "Patricia took a hearing aid from a passenger during takeoff," Mary said. "But not just any passenger. It's Dr. Thomas Wilson." Captain Edwards frowned. "The surgeon? The one who was on the news last month?" "Yes," Mary nodded. "The same one. He's sitting in row 14 writing notes to communicate because he can't hear without his device." Meanwhile, in the main cabin, something interesting was happening. News about Thomas was spreading from seat to seat. More passengers had recognized him from television shows and news stories about his charity work. A middle-aged woman in row 10 turned to her husband. "That man saved my nephew in Birmingham," she said quietly. "My nephew had a rare heart problem. No other doctor would take the case because it was too risky. But Dr. Wilson did the surgery, and now my nephew is a healthy 12-year-old boy." An older gentleman 2 rows behind her joined the conversation. He built 3 hospitals in areas most doctors won't even visit, places where people had no medical care at all before he came. "I read about him in a magazine last year." Someone else added, "He trains local people to be medical helpers, so care can continue after he leaves." A quiet feeling of anger spread through the plane. How could someone treat this kind man so badly? And all because of what? The color of his skin? His disability? Captain Edwards decided this situation needed his personal attention. He asked his co-pilot to take over the controls. Then he left the cockpit and walked to the front section of the plane where Patricia was serving drinks. "Patricia," he said in a low, serious voice. "I need the hearing aid you took from the passenger in row 14. Patricia looked surprised. "I was just following the rules about electronic devices," she said. Captain Edwards looked her straight in the eyes. "No," he said firmly. "You were following." "Prejudice. There's a difference." Patricia's face turned red. She opened a drawer and took out the small plastic bag with Thomas's hearing aid. "Come with me," Captain Edwards told her. The captain walked down the aisle toward row 14. He could see Thomas sitting by the window writing something on a notepad. The woman next to him was reading it and nodding. Despite everything that had happened, Thomas looked calm. There was no anger on his face, only patience and dignity. Captain Edwards stopped at row 14. He knelt down beside Thomas's seat so they would be at the same eye level. He made sure Thomas could see his face clearly. "Dr. Wilson," the captain said slowly, making sure his lips were visible so Thomas could read them. "I cannot apologize enough for what happened." Thomas looked surprised to see the captain kneeling beside him. Captain Edwards held out the plastic bag with the hearing aid. "This should never have been taken from you," he said. Thomas took the bag and nodded his thanks. He carefully took out the small device and put it back in his ear. He adjusted. Suddenly, the world of sound returned to Thomas. He could hear the hum of the plane engines. He could hear people talking. He could hear a baby crying somewhere in the back of the plane. He could also hear the whispers from the passengers around him. "That's him. Dr. Wilson. Saved so. Many lives. Can't believe how they treated him." Thomas looked at Captain Edwards. "Thank you," he said simply. "No thank you, Dr. Wilson," the captain replied, "for your patience and understanding in this terrible situation." Thomas could see Patricia standing a few steps behind the captain. She was looking at the floor, her face still red with shame. "Would you mind telling me why this happened?" Thomas asked the captain calmly. Captain Edwards hesitated. He glanced back at Patricia, then looked at Thomas again. "I believe it was discrimination, sir," he said honestly. "Plain and simple, and it's unacceptable. Thomas nodded slowly. Then this is an opportunity for growth, isn't it? The captain looked surprised. He had expected anger or demands for justice. But Thomas was talking about growth, about learning. Patricia looked up, also surprised by Thomas's words. Most people would be demanding that she lose her job right now, the captain said, nodding toward Patricia. Firing her won't solve the real problem, Thomas said. It would just hide it. Thomas had experienced discrimination many times in his life, as a black child growing up with a hearing problem, as a medical student when professors doubted his abilities, as a doctor when patients sometimes requested another doctor when they saw him walk into the room. He had learned that anger, while natural, rarely changed people's hearts. Education, on the other hand, often did. Would you be willing to sit down and talk with me about what happened today? Thomas asked, looking directly at Patricia now. Not to shame you, but so we can both learn something. Patricia stared at him in disbelief. This man, who she had treated so poorly, was offering her a chance to talk, to learn, to grow. Yes, she said quietly. I would. The passengers watching this scene couldn't believe what they were seeing. Many people, after being treated the way Thomas had been treated, would have demanded punishment. They would have wanted revenge. But Thomas Wilson was different. Even after facing such unfair treatment, Thomas wasn't thinking about punishment. He was thinking about education, about how this difficult moment might lead to something better, not just for him, but for Patricia, and for future passengers who might be treated the same way. The captain stood up and shook Thomas's hand. Dr. Wilson, he said, it's an honor to have you on my aircraft. The plane landed smoothly at Heathrow Airport in London. Thomas Wilson gathered his things, thanked Emma for her kindness during the flight, and prepared to leave. He had his important medical conference tomorrow. He needed to get to his hotel and review his notes one last time. As Thomas walked into the airport building, he noticed a man in a dark suit holding a sign with his name on it. Thomas was confused. He hadn't arranged for anyone to meet him. Doctor Wilson? The man asked as Thomas approached. I'm David. Mr. Bennett has asked me to bring you to meet him. Mr. Bennett? Thomas asked. James Bennett, sir, the chief executive of the airline. Thomas was surprised. How did the airline's boss know about what had happened on the flight? David led Thomas to a private room in the airport. Inside, a tall man with silver hair stood up from behind a desk. Dr. Wilson, he said, stepping forward to shake Thomas's hand. I'm James Bennett. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Thomas shook his hand. I wasn't aware I had a choice, he said with a small smile. News of the incident reached our headquarters before your plane even landed, James explained. His face showed real worry. I'm mortified by what happened to you today. Word travels fast, Thomas said. Captain Edwards called it in himself, James said. He felt it was important that I hear about it directly. James gestured for Thomas to sit down. A woman brought in tea and water, then left them alone. Dr. Wilson, James continued, we're prepared for whatever action you wish to take against the airline. I understand completely if you want to file a formal complaint or take legal steps. Thomas looked down at his cup of tea. He thought about the day's events, the humiliation of having his hearing aid taken away, the kindness of Emma, the respect shown by Captain Edwards, and yes, even the shame on Patricia's face when she realized her mistake. Instead of legal action, Thomas said, looking up at James, I have a proposal. James leaned forward, listening carefully. Thomas explained that punishment wouldn't solve the real problem. Firing Patricia or paying him money wouldn't change the deeper issues. Instead, he offered to help create a training program for all airline staff about disabilities and unconscious bias. The best response to ignorance is education, not retaliation, Thomas said. We can use what happened today to help make sure it doesn't happen to someone else tomorrow. James looked at Thomas with growing respect. That's very generous of you. Dr. Wilson, it's not about being generous, Thomas replied. It's about being effective. I want real change, not just an apology. They talked for another hour. By the end, they had the beginnings of a plan. Thomas would help design a training program. The airline would make it mandatory for all staff. They would work together to turn this negative experience into something positive. That evening, Thomas checked into his hotel. He was tired from the long day, but felt good about the meeting with James Bennett. As he unpacked his suitcase, there was a knock at his door. A hotel worker handed him an envelope. "This was left for you at the front desk, sir," he said. Inside was a handwritten letter. Thomas recognized the handwriting from the name tag he had seen earlier that day. It was from Patricia, the flight attendant who had taken his hearing aid. "Dear Dr. Wilson," the letter began, "I've never been more ashamed of my behavior than I am today. When I looked at you, I didn't see a doctor, a humanitarian, or even just a person trying to travel. I saw you through the lens of my own prejudice." The letter continued, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know I'm listening now. Today was a mirror showing me something ugly in myself that I need to change. Thank you for your dignity in the face of my ignorance." Thomas sat looking at the note for a long time. It was not often that people could admit their mistakes so honestly. That took courage. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Emma, the kind passenger who had sat next to him on the plane. They had exchanged numbers before parting ways at the airport. "How are you holding up?" she wrote. Thomas thought about the question. The day had been difficult, yes, but also surprising in many ways. "Better than expected," he replied. "Something good might come from this after all." He told her about his meeting with James Bennett and the plans for a new training program. Emma was impressed. Most people would have just been angry, she wrote back. "Anger is easy," Thomas replied. "Change is harder, but more important." Thomas spent the next day preparing for his presentation at the medical conference. When he stepped onto the stage the following morning, he felt ready. The room was packed with doctors and medical experts from around the world. Thomas showed them his new surgical technique step by step. He explained how it could be used in places without expensive equipment, how it could save lives in poor countries where good health care was hard to find. When he finished speaking, the room filled with applause. People stood up, clapping loudly. Many doctors came to him afterward, wanting to learn more, wanting to use his method in their own work. It was a great success. His years of hard work would now help save thousands of lives. But as Thomas left the conference that evening, he thought about his week in London. His new surgical technique was important, yes, but perhaps his meeting with the airline was just as important in its own way. By responding to discrimination with dignity and wisdom instead of anger, he had created an opportunity for real change. His work at the conference would save lives in faraway places, but his work with the airline might change hearts and minds right here, helping people see beyond their prejudices. Sometimes, Thomas thought, the most important surgeries aren't performed on the body, but on how we see each. 1 year passed quickly. Thomas Wilson had been busy. His new surgical method was now being taught in medical schools. Doctors in poor countries were using it to save lives. Thomas had traveled to 8 different countries to teach his technique. Today, Thomas was taking another flight with the same airline. He had not planned it this way. It just happened that this airline had the best time for his trip to a medical meeting in Paris. Thomas felt a little nervous as he walked onto the plane. The last time he had flown with this airline had been that difficult day when his hearing aid was taken away. But much had changed since then. Thomas found his seat by the window. He put his bag in the overhead bin and sat down. As he settled in, a voice came over the speakers. Something about the voice made Thomas look up. It sounded familiar. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Flight 305 to Paris. My name is Patricia, and I'm your head flight attendant." Today, Thomas couldn't believe it. Patricia, the same flight attendant who had taken his hearing aid a year ago. What were the chances? The plane filled with passengers. Thomas watched as the flight attendants prepared for takeoff. Yes, it was definitely her. Patricia looked different somehow. She moved with more confidence. She smiled more easily. But it was the same person. After the safety demonstration and after the plane was in the air, Patricia walked down the aisle checking on passengers. When she reached Thomas's row, she stopped suddenly. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Dr. Wilson?" She said softly. "Is that you?" Thomas smiled and nodded. "You probably don't remember me, but I remember you, Patricia," Thomas said kindly. Other passengers continued their conversations, not noticing this important moment happening in the middle of the plane. Patricia's eyes filled with tears. She quickly wiped them away. "After what happened last year, I almost quit my job," she said quietly. "I was so ashamed. But then the airline started the sensitivity training program you helped create. It changed me." Thomas hadn't known what had happened to Patricia after that day. He had helped design the training program with James Bennett, just as they had planned. But then he had gone back to his busy life, his medical work. "I now lead the airline's inclusion initiative," Patricia continued with pride in her voice. "It's become my passion." "That's wonderful to hear," Thomas said, truly meaning it. "We've trained over 2,000 staff members so far," she said, "and passenger complaints about discrimination have dropped by 80%. Thomas watched Patricia throughout the flight. She was kind and patient with everyone. She helped an elderly man with his oxygen mask. She spent extra time with a mother struggling with 2 small children. She reassured a nervous passenger who had never flown before. Patricia had changed. She had transformed her prejudice into compassion. The same hands that had taken away Thomas's hearing aid now offered help to others. When the plane landed in Paris, Patricia approached Thomas again. She handed him a white envelope. "What's this?" Thomas asked. "Open it," Patricia said with a smile. Inside was a formal invitation. The airline wanted Thomas to speak at their annual conference. They wanted him to share his experience and talk about the positive changes it had inspired. "Your response to my discrimination created more change than anger ever could have," Patricia said. "You could have demanded I be fired. You could have sued the airline. Instead, you offered to help us learn and grow. You showed me a different way to be." Thomas was moved by her words. He thought about the surgical technique he had developed. It was now being used in 12 countries. It had saved thousands of lives. He was proud of that achievement. But watching Patricia's transformation reminded him that changing one heart could sometimes make just as much difference as saving many lives. Both were important work. Later that evening, after his meetings in Paris, Thomas called Emma. They had become good friends over the past year. They talked almost every week. "You'll never guess who I saw today," Thomas said. "Who?" Emma asked. "Patricia, the flight attendant from last year." "No way! What happened?" Thomas told Emma about the surprising meeting, about how Patricia now led the airline's inclusion program, about the invitation to speak at their conference, and get this, Thomas added, the airline just won an industry award for their inclusion program. "All because you chose education over anger," Emma said. "You could have responded so differently that day." Sometimes, Thomas reflected, our worst moments can lead to our greatest contributions. Thomas thought about all the turns his life had taken. Growing up with a hearing problem had made him want to help others. Facing discrimination had made him want to fight against it. And that difficult day on the plane had created an opportunity for real, lasting change. He had helped many people through his medical work. But perhaps his most important work had been showing Patricia and the entire airline that even in our worst moments, we can choose understanding over anger, education over punishment, growth over blame. By responding to prejudice with dignity and wisdom, Thomas had not only stood up for himself, he had helped change an entire system for the better, and in the process, he had helped change lives, starting with Patricia's. The next day, as Thomas boarded his return flight home, 3 different flight attendants recognized him and thanked him for his contribution to their training. Each one told him how the program had opened their eyes to their own biases. Thomas smiled as he took his seat. One small moment, one difficult experience, one choice to respond with education instead of anger, all of it had rippled outward, touching more lives than he could count. Sometimes the greatest healing happens not in operating rooms, but in human hearts.